Hello, Michael here from Small Robot Studio with a Renderman and Nuke tutorial. And today we're going to be looking at how to do some basic AOV outputs from Renderman and Maya and do some simple compositing with Nuke. So if this is your first time using Nuke, this will be a good tutorial for you. Otherwise, if you're just looking for the basic workflow, I'll be covering that here. So what we've got here is a very simple scene with a singular light with a single backlight there. And if I just switch to my render camera and run that as an IPR, this is what you will see in the final render. So you can see that we've got three different types of material here, or four I suppose. We've got the specular one on the left hand side, we've got a diffuse one in the center, and then we've got a transmissive or a glass style one on the right hand side, as well as this metallic sort of one here at the back. This light here is set to be visible, so this is actually going to be visible in the final render, and that's worth noting. And also this is what the the noisy version would look like, and this is an approximation of the denoised version, though do remember that denoising in batch and denoising in the IT previewer are slightly different algorithms, so they work slightly different. So to set up our scene for render, the first thing we do is go to our render settings here, and we want to make sure that we've got the correct camera set to renderable. If you're rendering an animation, you obviously want to set your frame range here under animation. And then we want to define our image size here, which we're just going to set to HD 1080. Next, we'll go to the Renderman tab, and so far as your Renderman settings go, you'll want to make sure you check out my basic render settings tutorial. It covers what each of those things mean. We're really only going to be looking at AOVs here. So we're going to go to the AOVs tab, and this is what you're presented with. So basically what you see here is on the right hand side, these are the AOVs, or the arbitrary output values, which just means a bunch of different images are going to be printed up on render. And each one of these drop down lobes, which at the moment there's only one, and it's the beauty pass. Each one of those is comprised of multiple layers, similar to what you'd expect to see in a Photoshop document. So it's got multiple layers. This is the same sort of thing. So at the moment, our beauty renderer is going to have a color layer and an alpha layer. So we'll start by adding an extra layer to that. So if we scroll down here under the standard lobe, select Z, select the beauty lobe, and click this button here, it'll add this Z pass in. And we'll use this once we get into Nuke. So if you want to create your own arbitrary output values, or AOVs, we can create a new display here, and we can set this to be called something else. So we'll call it our_AOV. And we can add in the broken out versions of what is in this. So make it a little bit more controllable in Nuke. So if we go down into lighting, we can select direct diffuse, direct specular, indirect diffuse, and indirect specular, and then our AOVs, and add those in. So now we can look at all these separate channels after rendering and make changes to those separate layers. Now, because we're using refractive material, you would generally want to put in the glass lobe. However, I've found that it causes a lot of errors. So what I am going to recommend doing as an alternative, if you have refraction in your scene, is go down to the denoiser tab, and this is going to give us a slightly different way of doing this. So I'm going to create another AOV, and I'm going to call this denoiser. And we'll select diffuse and specular. So I'm just selecting those by control clicking each, and then denoise and add that in and use existing node. So that should just be diffuse and specular there. Now, each one of these, if we wanted to denoise its passes that are underneath it, we have to select the heading and scroll down here and select denoise. So we'll do the same for these two here as well. So select our AOV, scroll down, click denoise. Same for denoiser. Even though it's called denoiser, we do still have to enable that. Okay, and finally, before we render, we want to go to the Features tab, go down to Sample Filters, right-click, and create PXR Crypto Matte. After we've done that, we'll go up to Renderman and click Batch Render. And hey, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, otherwise you may be missing out on the many tutorials that we're releasing for free each week here on YouTube. So assuming everything went to plan, this is what you should be presented with upon completion. So the first task here is your beauty pass with the color, the alpha, and the Z channel underneath it. Then we have the denoise of the other passes that we created. And this is where it should be printed to inside of your project directory. So it should be under images and then the most recent file, which in this case is the AOV tutorial folder that I have. And to explain what each of these is, if we're looking at our AOVs here in Maya on the right hand side, what we can see here is our beauty variant and filtered. The variant is the raw image output and the filtered is the denoised version. Next we have the denoiser, and this is going to be this one here. This is actually the noisy version, and then the filtered is the denoised version. And then again, our AOVs, we're going to have the filtered version, which is this, and then this is the noisy version, same thing. Our Cryptomat is the thing that we generated on the features tab. So let's open Nuke now. So before we get into Nuke, I'm just going to give you a quick overview of some of the things that we can do to put it in context. So here is a finished comp that I did a few years ago now. And how I set this up is actually available as a separate tutorial that I did. So if you want to have a look at that, how to create volumetrics in Nuke. And what I've done here is I've taken it from a very basic render all the way through, adding volume rays, adding it back in with some noise, adding it as an overlay, using Z depth to add volume to the scene, which is also a separate tutorial, adding Z defocus, a vignette, and then using a chromatic aberration, which you can see on the edges of the scene here, to emulate an older lens. Lens distortion, which will create some slight barreling, disable that and enable it. You can see the difference there. Film grain, and then finally a write node to render it out. So you can get an idea of how complicated you can get in Nuke. Now this is sort of a little bit more complicated than what we're obviously going to be covering today, but a lot of what I'm going to touch on will sort of funnel you toward these concepts and ideas and being able to really manipulate your image after you've done the final render. And when you open Nuke for the first time, this is what you should see. And the first thing we want to do is hit the S key for settings. And we want to change our resolution to the format that we have, which is HD 1080. Now, if you're looking to do your color management, it's going to be in this tab here. For this tutorial, I'm not going to be looking at color management because that would require us to go back a few steps in the production pipeline, so we won't cover that here. But for reference, that is where you would find it. So let's bring in our images, and the easiest way to do that is to go to your directory where they are saved, select them all, and just drag them in. And we can have a look at what we've got here. So first off, we've got the two beauty versions. So this is the beauty with the denoise version and the noisy version. Then we have the denoise and the denoise with the denoising on. We've got the Cryptomat here, which we'll cover in a moment. And then we've got our separated AOVs. So we've got the AOV raw and the AOV denoised. So we'll put those over here. So if we're wanting to look at any of these renders, we can select the image and hit 1. However, you'll notice on these ones here, we can't do that. That's because we need to bring the individual channels out to see them. So we're going to work on this one here, which is our AOV filtered to begin with. So we're just going to hit tab and type in shuffle. And a shuffle node will just break out the individual layers of the AOV. So if we double click on that and hit 1, we'll be looking at that. We also want to go up here and just make sure this is set to 1. Otherwise, we're going to have a list of different properties for different nodes, and that kind of gets a bit messy. So with our shuffle node focused, we're going to go to the input layer and select diffuse channel. And you can see we've got the diffuse there. We can go down to direct specular. We can go down to indirect diffuse and indirect specular, and we can see all those individual channels. Now, if we are working with the denoise filtered, we could do the same thing. So shuffle, and we're going to connect this up here. And what you'll notice is we've only got the diffuse and the specular available to us. So if we want to combine all these outputs, if we go back over to our AOV filtered, we need a couple of different shuffle channels. So I'm just going to copy that and paste it a couple of times. And what we want to do is run the B from each channel, each shuffle node rather, into our AOV. And then we'll assign each one an AOV. So this is going to be direct diffuse, and we're going to change the name of this. This will be indirect diffuse, and so on. So once you've got those all shuffled out, you should have something that looks like this, where we can cycle through those individual channels. So we need to connect all these up together, and to do that, we're just going to use a plus node, which is a merge. So what we do to begin with is we'll set the B channel to be this diffuse, and then the A channel to be this one here. And then again, create a new plus. And we keep the B in the vertical and the A bringing in new things to our channel. So it kind of runs in a nice vertical. And we'll add one more plus. And we can connect all those up and you can see them all there together. However, you will notice there is one difference. And if we look at our beauty filtered, it is, well, two differences actually. This transmissive material here, it's not transmissive, it is only specular. And the second thing is I didn't render out the emissive layer. So we need to do those two things. Now, as I mentioned earlier, if we're wanting to get our transmissive, we would want to use the transmissive glass lobe as the direct and indirect. However, I have found that this doesn't necessarily work too well, or it creates errors. I'll try it again here just for the sake of argument. So this is transmissive glass lobe and indirect specular glass. And onto this, we'll also set this to denoise. And finally, we want to get our emissive, which will create a new lobe for as well. Call that emissive and add that in. Now the emissive generally doesn't need to be denoised. We can try denoising it. I have found that this does create errors. Because we don't need to render out these other layers, what I'm going to go through do is right click on them and turn them to off. The beauty layer does have to be enabled though. You cannot do AOVs without it. So we'll keep that on and we're going to quickly re-render this. Okay, so no problems on render this time. If you are having errors on it, you can try doing different render passes or restarting your computer. Before recording this version of this tutorial, I was having issues, so I couldn't solve it aside from restarting the computer. So sometimes that just is the way it is. And because the errors do not actually print the errors, it's somewhat difficult to troubleshoot these. So we should have our new AOVs. So we'll just jump back into Nuke. And one other thing I'd like to mention about our emissive pass, your emissive pass will apply to any visible light source. So that will include a dome light with an HDRI. So if you've got one of those and you do want it to be visible, you do want one of these passes. So let's grab our new passes from Windows Explorer. So we want this transmissive and we want the emissive. Let's have a look how they went. So we'll start with our transmissive filtered here. So we'll just shuffle out again. And we're going to shuffle out our transmissive glass lobe. And if we look at that, that's what we should be seeing. And I was mistaken actually, indirect we already have, so we do not need that one after all. So we'll just use a plus node again and connect this to here. Then if we look at that, we should have almost everything. So the only layer that we're missing now is the emissive, if we compare that to our other one. So again, we will grab our emissive filtered, bring this one in here, shuffle again. Emissive, check what that looks like. So it's just the light source there. A plus, B will go up the top there, A will go here, and you can see now that if we look at the plus, I'll just hit 1 on plus and then I'll hit 2 on the filtered. Switching between the two, they are identical. So this is great. I've done all these different things and I've essentially just made the same thing all over again. Doesn't seem particularly helpful, I know, but it's when we start introducing masks and controlling different aspects of the render is where you can see that it gets quite powerful. And this is a very basic render, mind you, but what we'll begin with is our indirect specular, and that should look like this. So let's say we want to make this one here, the specular, a little bit less intense. So we'll create a bit of space here by shifting these along. And we want to use our cryptomat. So we'll select our cryptomat and type in cryptomat here and select that and hit 1. And what we can do here is use any of these randomly assigned colors to select objects in the scene. So if we hold down Control and left click on something, it will highlight that, and that is now masked. We can do the opposite by selecting pick or remove and Control and click on it. So what we want to do is click on this here, and we want to use this as a mask to say control the gain of this. So we'll just use a grade node in this example, and we'll just drag that in there between those two. So what we can do here is if we look at the grade, and we can change the gain. So you can see that's just controlling the gain of the overall image. So if we set it to be, say, lower, it's setting everything to be lower. If we zoom into the grade here, you see this got this mask node, and we can connect it to our crypto map. So now when we change the gain, it is only affecting that one selected object. So we can go down to here, select our grade node again, and control it while looking at the final render. So basically we could even get rid of all of the indirect specular by removing the gain. This applies to all different aspects of the scene. So we could go through and change the colors of things using a hue saturation node. For example, I'll do that on the diffuse just quickly using the same exact method. I'll just copy these up and we'll use a hue shift. Plug that in after the diffuse, run the mask into the crypto mat, and with the crypto mat we will just select that center object which has got the diffuse color on it. So with the hue shift now we can just change the saturation if we wanted. We could change the actual hue itself so it's got a completely different color, and we can look at that in its final form as well. So all of those different colors. So you can see how this could be quite useful and powerful if you wanted to back specific parts of the scene off. Now finally, what is another common thing that we will do in compositing is create depth of field, and we do this using a Z defocus node. So we'll pop one of those in, Z defocus, and we need to plug the image in here. And what we need to look for is the depth Z channel, but we actually don't have that because we haven't rendered that out in this pass. So we want to grab our beauty variance because the denoise version actually doesn't have the Z channel on it. And we're going to grab this handle here, we'll plug that into the beauty variance. And then we need to set this to A, and we want to select depth. So you see you've got depth and it's got depth.z. So we want to make sure that's going into the now newly created depth channel and hook that up. So this should look no different than what it was previously, obviously aside from the differences that we made to it with those adjustments that we made. So selecting our Z defocus node and double clicking on it, you can see we've got this focal point, and we can put this on anything that we want and have that be our new focal point. So we'll just set this to say 25 and 50. We want to set our math to depth. We want to set our result to output, though we can set it to focal plane setup if you want to see what is actually in focus here. So as I move this around, you can see that different parts of the scene will be in focus. The parts that are out of focus will be the red will be the foreground, the blue will be the background being out of focus. So I could focus really close into the foreground, and if I set this back to result, you can see that it's out of focus, or I can shift it to this pillar here in the background and the foreground starts to be out of focus a little bit here. So I've got the size set to 25 and the maximum set to 50. This is fairly unintuitive. It is not much like a real camera works. So generally I would just start with 25 and 50 as your basic settings, and then I would go from there. I don't really want to get too deep into explaining this, otherwise it's going to get a little bit convoluted. But there's a basic way to get started anyway. Depth of field will literally just be the amount of the scene that is in focus. So as you make this smaller, less and less will be in focus, like so. Now this is a very basic scene obviously, so it doesn't have a lot of depth, but you get the idea. Now for those of you who are having issues getting the AOVs separated, the denoise filtered is what you will use, and use the exact same method. So you can see that looks identical to our other render if we look at those. So the only difference being is that if you do this method, you'll only be able to affect the diffuse, well the specular, I misnamed that, and the diffuse there, just using a plus to combine those. So the transmissive and the specular and indirect specular will be combined, as will the indirect diffuse and direct diffuse. So a little bit less control, but generally it will still be okay for what you're probably looking to do at this level. So after you've done your denoising, something you might like to add is some grain, which will just flatten the image a little bit more and make everything work together. If we are compositing a fairly substantial render. That's probably what I would generally do in animations like. So we can just set it to a film grain that you like. If you're matching a film, then obviously you'd use the correct film grain. Not going to worry too much about that. And then after that, we're going to use a write node. And the write node will just write your image or images. Now, if you are rendering out a animation, we will add frame padding. Actually, regardless of whether you're doing an animation or not, we'll add frame padding. So to start with, we'll go to the write node, click open here, select your output directory, and give it a name. So in this case, I'm just going to call this tutorial hash 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 hash. So that's going to be a frame padding of 4. So each hash will equal 1 digit. So if it's frame number 10, the number it will be given is 0010. If it's frame number 23, it will be 0023. And then .png. Save that, it'll update the settings, and you can click render and it'll render it out. So here's the render open from my desktop, and you can see it looks exactly like it did in Nuke. So it's pretty basic to get started. That is pretty much the entire workflow. There's a lot more you can do in Nuke. There's much more complicated scenes that you can set up. But if you're just starting out with Renderman and Nuke, and these are maybe some of your first renders, being able to control these little things will probably just help your renders get over the line without you having to re-render things because you missed a light value or something like that. So hopefully you found this useful. And if you have, make sure you hit the like button. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe as we bring out tutorials like this very often here on YouTube for free. Thank you to all our patrons. As per usual, you guys are awesome. You're keeping the channel lights on, so we appreciate all your support. And if you want to become a patron, check out the link below. You'll get a bunch of extra rewards, as including tutorial assets for previous tutorials up to date, and extra video content as well. That's all for now. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time. That's it for this tutorial. If you found it useful, make sure you leave a like so other people can find it. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe, as we're bringing out CG and illustration tutorials every week, just like this one. Become a patron and access tutorial assets, bonus content, a private Discord, and more by clicking the link below.